Yep. Thank you, Larry. So as we open up our communication cycle slide deck, these are the slides from the class, and just kind of take a look at an overview of how this walks through. Remember, we've gone through orientation, we've talked about the communication profile. At the end of day one, people start to get a little, they're like thought out. So this is a great slide to kind of, or a great module, start to pick up the pace a little bit and shift into teaching. We start always with our learning objectives. It's important to read these. It's important to emphasize the bolded words, orientate people to where we are in the process, just like I did with you. We were in orientation, communication profile, and now we're heading into the communication cycle. This is a fun spot to highlight that there are modules in the module, that there are icons within this icon, and that we'll be going into those deeper. And then we shift into this class discussion. We invite someone, just like Lindsay modeled for us, where we invite someone to read the quote on the slide and then reflect on, like what does this mean to you? At all times with class discussions, you'll see on your teaching arc that we'll look at here in just a moment, that's when we're starting to shift up into maybe a higher zone than where we started from. With communication cycle, we are only kind of shifting into zone 2, and this is where we were looking at moving into zone 2. We're giving people that opportunity to think about, like, why is communication important? We all know we do it, but why is it really important? And so this discussion will then lead us into this vital slide, which we've already really talked about. And then really bringing it home with the presence and voice. And this is where the Zoe slide resides, the Zoe story resides from Max Dupree, where we share either that story and we share it in a way that we create connection and personalization to it, or we can share a story of our own about a time where someone really impacted us with their presence in our lives. And that's really creating this moment of inspiring people to want to think about, well, how do I communicate? Why is it important? So that's the front end of these first 6 slides as we head into communication cycle. And then we shift from there into the science of the communication cycle. So we talk about the art and science. This section up here where how we show up in the process is the art of the communication cycle. And then science of the communication cycle, the very practical spots and steps of it. And to help people understand where they want to focus on in this module, to maybe glean an insight or do an improvement, we move into the self-check. The self-check is in their workbook. This is where you want to kind of facilitate your time and be aware of other people or your participants' tendencies with this. You'll see different tendencies whip through this really quick. You'll see others really taking time to reflect and take time in answering the question. We want them to really spend the time reflecting, where did this conversation go wrong? So giving them the time to fill out that self-check, reflect on that conversation, answer those questions with a yes and no, and then move into highlighting. What are the ones that are a no or a question mark? I always have mine for my class as an example in my hand so they can see the massive amounts of highlights in the sections so that I can say, this is mine from class. And there are sections that I knew I needed to improve on. With the self-check, you'll see, you can kind of see it here. You'll see on the side of the self-check that in green, we have tied the different questions to the sections of the communication cycle. So this self-check will help them then understand what are the areas they want to focus on. And then we would move into that with a monitor your motivation for them to reflect and consider what do they want to improve on. And then it shifts into teaching. We're teaching the steps of the communication cycle. And we saw some of our colleagues do that already today. And the icons that exist here are very beneficial to us. When Jamie, I think it was Jamie, when Jamie did the I send a message, she referenced the icon here. They're there for a reason to help your facilitation. And then there is that moment where, as Kristen did for us, there's that pause of like, well, now we're shifting over the line. And that gives us that transition into now I'm the other and I'm receiving a message. That leads us into what Barbara did for us, really highlighting the 5 reflective listening skills. And then Lindsay's reflection on, well, why does this matter? Why is this relevant to us? And gives us the opportunity for the class discussion. So there's some real practical teaching spots, and then there's these moments where we pause and we think about what we're learning. We then shift into decoding all of the information, and you guys have already been talking about that, like what is the information that we're collecting and how we decode a message, and then build that response back, and then we send it with those facts and feelings. And this is a spot that then we can also highlight that we'll be delving more into this tomorrow in the reflective listening module. We take a moment and pause and say, well, this sounds all really good and this makes sense, but sometimes things get in the way, that we have these barriers and these filters to communication. This is a fun slide to maybe have some discussion around. You've been teaching quite a bit, and so to stop and have some discussion about some barriers to communication. Then from that conversation, you can lead into this realization that talking and communicating are not the same. We go into a brief self-check that you can do as a group, our review, and then let them know what their homework is for that night. It is a quick overview of this module. Are there any questions before I shift out of this slide deck back to our others that anyone has about any of the particular slides?
I have a question. This is Jules Maloney, and I'm wondering if it's something that I could just plant a seed for when we all meet face to face. And this has a lot to do with my own DISC tendencies, but when we meet in March, I would love to hear from folks how the self-check landed for them. It'll certainly help me in how I support others in connecting with it. And then the other piece I'd love to hear from folks in the future was how they experience the process of repeating I am the message 2 or 3 times, what that experience was like for me. I only have my lens, and I really want to expand that view by hearing other folks' experiences. And I'm guessing we don't have time in this call, so maybe in March would be a great time to hear feedback on that.
Thank you, Jules. We will have lots of opportunity in March to talk about some of those, like how do we bring information into the classroom? How does it feel? And I'm pretty sure that actually these slides are part of our teachbacks in March. And so that'll be a great opportunity to kind of play with that and feel that around. It can feel a little awkward and contrived, like we'll just say that out loud. And so the more fun you have with it, the more you really tie it to the meaning like Kristen demonstrated for us, the more you'll have your audience buy-in. All right, let's take a look at then. So that was our walk and talk. Again, the communication cycle module is one you can maybe buy some time on if you run late. It's also one if you're running long that you can save for the next. We'll talk about that in March about how do we make adjustments with our timing and our facilitation, just like Larry and I have today, where we felt it was more important to hear from everyone and then maybe move through this section a little faster. So from an insight standpoint, remember we always have that teaching arc. And looking at the teaching arc, as I mentioned before, that front section of we build our case for the importance of listening is really heading us into just zone 2. Not a lot of distress, but starting to get people really thinking about, like, okay, how do I show up? What is my presence like? How was I impacted by others when they really shown up for me? And that gives that whole discussion time, that vital need. It's also an opportunity. Sometimes people will push back a little bit about, well, you know, is communication really important? Like, I feel like we think it in our head, but we don't really believe it in our hearts. This is where we can start to really inspire that wow, if I really want to create connection, if I really want to improve my relationships and get my needs met, then communication and looking at the communication cycle is really important. And then moving back down into just the facilitation of utilizing the communication cycle, that's that self-check, taking some time there, and then the rest of it just moves us into teaching the 7 steps, discussing the filters, and then moving us out. From a preparation standpoint, I think the self-check is probably the biggest thing that you'll want to prepare for. It's somewhere where maybe you could share a story, or maybe a story that you've woven through. I always share that this class saved my marriage, and that going through the self-check showed me where I was screwing up in communication and how it was affecting my husband's ability to hear me. And so you could see the problem on the top of the self-check and the bottom of the self-check. So creating some sort of connection to the importance of just pausing and taking a look at that self-check is going to be important, because it's really heading towards helping them be motivated to apply the steps of the communication cycle intentionally in their lives. The presence and the voice slide, or the story there, is also a really integral section. And whether you use Max Dupree's story about his granddaughter
I'm wondering, Sarah, if your battery died and we've lost you.
She's
Okay.
definitely frozen.
I think her battery.
Okay, I
battery
wasn't
was
sure.
dying. Yeah.
Let me take over. Let me take over from here.
All right. Larry, let me know if you need to
and,
pull up anything.
Let's see. I am going to, we don't have her to advance the slides either.
Give me a minute,
but-
Larry, and I'll pull up the slide deck and get you back to that point. Oh, I don't think.
Okay.
No, nope, I'm lying. I don't know if I can because she's not here. I will try. Hang on.
Okay. While she's doing that, one of the slide that was up on the screen, what's on the screen now, is the how to prepare for this particular module. And let me say this while we're here: the 4 of you that did teach backs prepared phenomenally. That is just the epitome of what we want to do. So thank you to the 4 of you. It mentions there to commit to memory the presence and voice story. If you can tell that story from memory, it can be more impactful. The Max Dupree story. It just helps. It helps the class connect with you rather than the material. And if you can be prepared in that way, or have your own story, and we'll talk about that in St. Louis, that you have the opportunity to share a different story if there's one that applies to this particular module. The teaching tactics for this, and if you have, I'll go ahead and speak to these bullet points. If you have them, take a look at them. The first one there, emphasize the verb and play the movie trailer on the learning objective slides. We noted that in the teaching arc, there's a peak right at the beginning, and this is your opportunity as a facilitator to really create some interest, because it can be a little clinical, and stories are helpful. You want to engage the participants and draw them into the idea that this is important. You can use the module icons, the little circle of things, to talk about that. Personal stories, self-disclosure, that is pivotal in terms of, and we saw that this morning. You guys did a terrific job of pulling in stories that actually happened, that are part of your life. Don't overteach the 5 listening skills. That's a common, I made that mistake many times. The first few times I facilitated, you present the whole course in that particular slide, and you blow the moment for the next day. So don't overteach those. Those are going to be covered in detail tomorrow. And I'm just going to make one stop here and ask the group, am I coming through?
Yes.
Yes, you are.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, very
Yes.
good. Thank you for that feedback. I was talking in space here, and with the technical difficulties, I wasn't sure. So we'll just keep going.
Can you all see
Teaching
my
tactics.
screen now? Larry, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Go one more slide to teaching tactics.
All right, just tell me when it's time to switch, okay?
It's time to switch. And the last item there, the big net with small holes. we cannot, well, can we overemphasize listening and the power of listening and what this is all about? The big net with the small holes. Once you cross that dotted line, that's what the class is about. So spend some time on that, rest on that, let it sit with the folks. Emphasize facts and feelings on the reflective listening. That is a key element and is new to a lot of people. This idea of speaking back what we heard them say. It's just so new to a lot of people, and it feels awkward at first when you first practice listening. So take this as an opportunity when you're going around that circle and you're talking about how you respond. It's not just I heard you. It's this is what I heard you say, and I'll bet it made you feel this way. And let that rest with the class to really, really grasp that, because tomorrow we're going to talk about listening, and or maybe it's later this day, but the next module will be listening, and they really, really need to. They need to grasp that. Next slide, Nina.
Didn't it move?
This is a real. Yep, thank you. These class discussions are important, especially in this module. And here are some phrases that you can just have in your hip pocket. And as you facilitate more and more, these questions will be available to you. They're like opening up your toolbox and knowing whether to pick up the screwdriver or the pliers. And it just invites the participants to come in and participate in the discussion. These are adults that we're speaking to. These people have experiences, and they are the ones that are the experts in their lives. And if we've shared and we invite them to share, it'll be a rich time, and everyone will learn from everyone. So this is a module that we really want to pull out, especially on this slide, but especially throughout this one, because it can be a little academic. Pull out this discussion, have some fun with it, talk about the stories, and it'll allow the slide to be impactful and lay the foundation. We're laying a foundation for listening. That's why this module is here. It's a foundational module to put on the new skills of listening on top of that. I'm just going to pause here for just a second and ask if there are any comments or questions to this point.
Yeah, Larry, it's Gary.
Yes,
Can
sir.
you hear me okay? Yeah,
Yes, I can.
questions I had, one of the things I struggle with in identifying facts and feelings is making sure that we get the feeling right. Because it doesn't feel good when someone ascribes a feeling to us that it doesn't match our feelings. And so just your thought
Okay.
about that.
So if I understand you, you're talking about the idea of what if we get their feelings wrong and we don't really capture it, but we're speaking back their facts and feelings and we miss it?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Okay. What's your experience in when that has happened to you?
Not very good.
Okay. Okay.
It's
Okay.
when someone ascribes feelings to me that don't match how I'm feeling, it makes me feel unheard or
Sure.
irritated or confused. And when I do that to the other person, I feel I get back. You weren't paying attention. How could you think that?
Mhm.
You're assuming things.
Sure.
So I think there's a lot of potential danger in that moment.
There is. There is. And it is a pivotal moment. And I think that's one of the reasons why we as humans tend to avoid that moment, because we can blow it. We can come across as knowing their insides when we really don't. The flip side of that is that we can be another human being that's striving to understand. And those are all the pieces of the nonverbals and how we approach the individual. If we are sincerely with empathy, making every effort we can to understand their feelings, it can be connecting. If we are a person who is stroking our beard and analyzing them and trying to figure them out, it can be distancing. And so, wow, I think if we were to open it up to the floor here, we would have a breadth of experiences on that idea of sharing our feelings. It does, or trying to articulate what the other person's feelings might be. It's risky. It's risky, but it's also incredibly engaging. I don't know if I landed in a place where you wanted an answer, or if I just spoke words.
No, and I think this is one of those things that we'll probably spend some time on in St. Louis, because I think it's a pivotal moment in the communication cycle that can, the vulnerability is awesome and it can bring us closer, but it's also a moment where if you miss, it could drive people apart. And so just practice.
Right, exactly. And
Larry,
go ahead with that comment. Yes.
I was just going to say, I think sometimes when we take a breath and reframe and say, the most important thing right now is our relationship and that you are heard. So sometimes we need to be as direct. I've heard my husband, who counsels people, he will just say, could you name that feeling? And sometimes it takes them back that he's so direct as a D, saying, can you name that feeling? And then they hammer it and they name the feeling. And then at that point, then it's kind of like pricking the balloon. It kind of like lets all that air out, the emotion out, and then you can move forward.
Yeah. Thank you, Kristen. Very, very true. Very true. You've been there.
Can I
We
share
are closing in. Go ahead and share an observation.
Well, one of the things is that, because in this module, it seems that we're really trying to show the participants the baseline, create validity around the vital need for this. But there's been language that's used in the training verbally that we kind of describe communication in a binary way, good or poor, right or wrong. And I worry that as we're trying to encourage people to move beyond where they're at, that seems kind of judgmental, especially when they're probably going to be self-judging themselves as they work towards this process. So I was trying to play around with some verbiage, and I don't know if maybe you have some in your battery, as opposed to poor, good, right, wrong. Like I was thinking intentional versus default. What comes default, or your typical or your comfortable space, down to intentional. Larry, do you have any that you could suggest away from the judgmental binary that sometimes we all default to?
Oh my goodness, that
just,
is
just for a second, this is Rachel. As a timekeeper, I just want to let everybody aware that we are 3 minutes away from 12:30. It is a very interesting discussion, but yes, thank you.
Oh, is it? Yes, and thank you for interjecting. That's great. That's great. We're going to tie this comment up just a little bit, and then we're going to move into what we're going to prepare for next week, and then we'll close the call. So the question on the floor is: are there words that are less judgmental than others? And yes, and you identified those. I have a lot of C in me, and I am fighting constantly with those words that identify right and wrong and good and bad. And I'm just gonna have to admit right here that I cannot come up with adjectives on the moment now. I would need to hear a specific case and identify different words, but the ones you suggested were excellent. Default and go-to, tendency, whatever.
Yep. Comfortable, intentional.
Yes, and that is really where we're trying to bring the class. We're not telling them what's right and wrong. We're giving them some information and allowing them to evaluate it. And if we keep that in our mind, our language should hopefully follow. Here's some information. Here's an idea. What do you think you get of it? What do you think of this information? And allow them to just sit with it. So that's something we'll talk about. I don't want to keep kicking the can down the road and say we're going to talk about this in St. Louis, but that is a pivotal item in St. Louis that we will talk about in a large group.